All right. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Take a moment. I want to take a moment for everyone to log in and join the call. So, grab some tea, grab some coffee. We'll start in about 20 or 30 seconds, so no rush. Also, thank you so much to those of you who tuned in last month. We had a really great discussion with Afra around vulnerability management. So a really interesting discussion, kind of talking about how we can be more dynamic with our vulnerability management process, or just kind of smarter with parsing out relevant CVEs for like our particular environment. So really encourage you to go check that out online as well. This month, though, I am personally really excited. We have a really exciting session, and I'm just excited to have Sudarshan back on. So he's going to be talking about defending the cloud perimeter, talking about that effective access and cloud identities. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started today. Hey, Sudarshan, I'm excited to have you back on. Thanks so much for joining us today. Why don't you take a moment, introduce yourself? I know you have a really interesting background.
Sure. I've been in Uptycs leading the cloud security capability. Prior to Uptycs, I've been with RSA and Symantec, mostly on the identity side, endpoint, and consumer security as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited for you to talk about the cloud identity piece here. I know you've been working really strongly on it with you and your team. So yeah, a quick introduction about myself. I'm a technical product marketer here at Uptycs. So prior to Uptycs, I worked at Deloitte focusing on day-to-day security operations and systems engineering for government clients. And yeah, in my spare time, I enjoy playing and watching soccer. So we have a great session planned for you today and a lot to cover. So I'll quickly go over this slide. A few housekeeping items. The webinar is expected to go around 25 to 30 minutes in total. So we just finished those introductions. Thank you so much, Sudarshan. This webinar will be a discussion around effective permissions. So we're really going to break this down into three main sections. First, we want to get everyone on the same page. What exactly are the challenges for identity in the cloud? What does this mean for your environment? What's that background piece? Why are people interested in the identity space, and really, what are the complexities around cloud identity? Next, we want to build on that foundation, and we really want to move into what actually is effective access. What are the actual, tangible, and discrete aspects of identity security in the cloud that are causing pain points, and where is this friction coming from? Where can we start thinking about solutions? And so obviously, that finally is going to build into that fourth point here of how to actually implement effective solutions and really scale effective access for your cloud perimeter. So as you can see here, we left time at the end for an open Q&A, but of course, use the Q&A box down below. Please ask questions along the way, and we'll keep an eye. So yeah, before we get started into the topic, though, just kind of curious, I'd love for folks to respond and put in the chat, what do you actually think is the new security perimeter? We put these three options down below. First, the networking layer, second, the data layer, and third, that IAM layer. So I believe you can enter in the chat either anonymously to share only with Sudarshan and myself, or you can just share it with a broader group. But yeah, I'm really curious kind of what people are thinking of when they think about these perimeter pieces. So when people think about their cloud environments, I feel like they often think about the network layer or the data layer first. But really, so many attacks come from the human layer. And that human layer, in a technological sense, is really that identity layer. So this effective access we're going to talk about with your resources is really that new age of your cloud perimeter. So Sudarshan, any thoughts here as we get into the background piece?
Nothing specific, Jeremy. So it's when you come from an on-premise world, people typically understand it's basically the networking piece where you build that moat through firewalls and whatnot. But I always curious about when it comes to the cloud, how do organizations think where the security perimeter is? It's just more of a poll, to your point. But the truth lies somewhere among these three. There's no right or wrong answer, but you want to hear everybody's perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point that you were talking about as we move into this kind of background of identity in the cloud. Identity itself is really an older term. It was really one of the first domains of security, but we're still dealing with complexity in this space, and it's really not clear what a role, what a resource, like an S3 bucket, what it can access. So I'm just kind of curious to set the stage. How is cloud identity different from traditional views of identity?
Yeah, no. When you talk about identity, a lot of people immediately associate that to, let's say, Microsoft Azure AD, Okta, Ping, the traditional identity providers of the world. So they do provide the authentication, they provide the SSO, they provide the access management for on-premise and also like SaaS applications. When it really talk about identity in the cloud, we are talking about the native capability that the hyperscalers like AWS, GCP, and Azure, they have built to basically provide authorization to all the resources that they have built. So if you think about all across all three hyperscalers, right, there are about 40,000 APIs that anybody can call to talk to the resources. When I say resource, it could be a GCP side, it could be a BigQuery. Now, Azure side, it could be Azure Tables. It could be on the AWS side, it could be S3 bucket, right? So when you think about those resources, to access those resources, there are about all the resources across all these three cloud providers, there are 40,000 APIs. So when you talk about access to the APIs, essentially these native cloud providers have built an authorization layer, and that's where the identity comes into picture. So these, when you think about identity, the traditional Oktas, Azure ADs of the world, you can dovetail their capabilities to connect to your cloud environment and essentially provide access to your cloud resources. That's what these two identities come together. And that way, in some ways it was same, some ways it's a little bit different. I just want to give you a different color of what identity means when it comes to the cloud, like a IaaS and a PaaS solution versus the traditional identity providers that connect to your Office 365 that provide authentication or SSO solutions.
No, that's really helpful. And I think for me, kind of hearing even just that term 40,000 APIs, it's crazy to me just how many layers there are to this identity mesh in a way. And if you're not familiar with it, how do you actually even begin to tackle this? This is an interesting slide here where it's kind of talking about if there's like an exploitation of this authorization layer that you're talking about, and someone is new to identity security, they might not actually be familiar with this scenario shown here, which is essentially kind of like a wild card, allow all access resource. So I'm just kind of curious walking through the ramifications of a scenario like this.
Yeah, so the essence of this whole topic today that we are discussing is, if you do not understand identity well, if you do not understand how to define a policy, which is actually the crux of IAM, if you do not know what the different types of identities are, then essentially whatever you do, whatever you create from a policy standpoint, you're basically creating a backdoor essentially. So as we talked about earlier, the APIs, right? You're just one step away from getting access to the resources through that API call, right? That's why it's called one step away from a breach. So if I know, if I have an overly permissive identity, which is a wildcard, if I don't know what I'm doing as a IAM admin, if I'm giving a wild permissions or unauthenticated access, essentially anybody can get access to your cloud services. That's what the bottom line is. And as part of the discussion, we're going to talk about what the complexities are and how you should be thinking about and how we can help you address those problems.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. And I think taking that foundation piece that, cloud identity is a little different than traditional identity, but the foundations are still there. It just has so many layers of complexity on top of it. We talked about those 40,000 APIs or these different authorization layers and authentication methods that you may be exposed to. There's just this mesh around your access. So I'd love to focus kind of back on the topic of today, which is really the idea of effective permissions. And the idea of effective permissions is really understanding all of the permissions that are granted by all the policies that affect a user or a role. So kind of when you think about building a security tool, what does effective permissions mean to you, and what are we trying to arm people with at the end of the day?
Correct. So before we go into effective permissions, well, first we need to understand the complexity of IAM policies, right? We should not be kidding ourselves that, hey, it's pretty easy to build an IAM policy for AWS or even use the policies that are provided by AWS, right? First thing is you have to understand what the complexities are. We'll go through what the complexities are one by one, but then the next step is, how do you know how to write a well-defined policy, right? As an IAM practitioner, if I'm new to cloud, if I'm coming from the on-premise side, I don't know how to define a policy, right? How do you write a well-defined policy? Next thing is, even if I do write a well-defined policy, how do you know if it's actually working? How do you know how effective that policy is, right? And then finally, last but not the least, is even if I do all that, if an auditor comes and knocks my door and says, can you tell me who can access that S3 bucket that has a PII data, like a social security number or your driver's license or whatever that may be, can you tell me who can lay hands on that data? Can you give me that list? If somebody asks this question, you should not be thinking twice, and your mean time to get that answer should be very short, right? But that's not the case today. That's the kind of a problems that we are talking about for existing organizations today.
Yeah, and I think just to kind of hone in on that last point you said, framing the question of who can access what is really kind of the fundamental question of identity. And it's really a simple question at the end of the day, but it just gets increasingly complex with these layers of policy on top of policies. It makes it difficult to understand, what can a resource or a human role actually access and interact with. So I know you kind of mapped out these 3 different use cases and complexities here. So I'm excited to kind of dig into them. This is how we might traditionally break it down with identity versus resource, but maybe kind of walk us through these allows and yeah.
Absolutely. So think of it as 3 separate problems, right? 3 separate complexities. The first one that we are talking about is, this is specifically to AWS, right? AWS has 6 different types of policies, right? A classic example that you're seeing here is what I call it as an identity policy and the resource policy. Resource policy is something like, it's saying that, let's say there is a door in your room, there is a lock in your room, right? And the room itself will tell you who can access, who can have access into this room, right? The other part of the equation is, as a user, I should also have access to say, yes, I can access the room. So think of that in the AWS terminology, there is an S3 bucket. S3 bucket has its own policy, and it will dictate who can actually access that bucket. On the flip side, if I'm a user, a role, or whatever the type of identity is, if I'm an identity sitting, I have my own policy that will tell me what all can I access within the AWS environment. So that's the kind of an essence. But just give you an example here. What you see in the slide is here, John Smith, for example, right? John Smith can list and read on a specific resource. That's what it's saying here. Whereas let's take Carlos Salazar, right? The person can actually list and read on resource Y and Z, but he cannot access resource X. If you see on the other side, the yellow color, where the resource X could be an S3 bucket or could be a KMS key, right? Here, the resource policy is saying, here are the list of users who can really access. Even if they can access, they can do read, write, or let's say list. So this is where, when you bring these 2 policies together, only then you will know effectively who can access what. This is just 2 policies. Now take the same problem statement and apply it to 6 different types of policies. It's kind of mind-boggling to really grasp around this and say, how do I bring all these 6 policies together and then figure out whether a specific role in an EC2 instance can access an S3 bucket? That's kind of really complex problem. That's what we are dealing with. That's the first level of complexity, right? The second one is around what I describe it as policy grammar, right? So if you drill deeper into policies itself, any type of policy, like we talked about identity policy, resource policy, or session policy, right? Or service control policies. There are different types of policies. Every policy has a specific statement. So what you see here gives you a kind of a crux of what goes into defining a policy, right? So in one policy block, I can say action equal to go fetch me something, right? Whereas not action is a negated form of that action. So in that case, I can say, do not fetch me something, right? Or maybe in action block, I can say only Jeremy can access it. Whereas in not action, I can say Jeremy cannot access it, right? It kind of gets really complex. So you need to parse through the policies, understand what the block says, and then translate that across 6 different types of policies. Now the problem is the 2-level problem. The first level is types of policies. The second level is the policy grammar, what goes into defining a policy. That's another level of complexity, right? Then the last but not the least is the number of policies. If you take any identity for that matter, an identity could have 10 policies to the maximum, right? That's a default. But you can pick up a phone and call AWS and say, can you increase the limit beyond 10 policies? They can do it. So that means theoretically, you're allowed to have more than 10 policies, right? But let's just talk about 10 policies. What you see here in the slide is there are 10 policies, the 4 policies for this user, right? let's say if one policy says allow Sudarshan to read, whereas the other policy says do not allow Sudarshan to read, right? Now you're going insane. What is my effective access, right? So you don't know what the effective access is. So this is the third level of complexity that we are talking about. Now, when you bring all these three together, now now can you tell me who can access what? I have absolutely no idea who can access what given these complexities. That's the problem that organizations are dealing with today when it comes to IAM in AWS specifically.
No, that's really helpful. And I think even thinking back to that complexity number one example of you have your two columns and you have John Smith maybe trying to access, resource X. And it says, John Smith has read and write access to resource X, but on the resource side, the permissions are denying John Smith. How do we actually parse that out? And then like the right language, is the language empowering us to make this easy to digest? And I don't know if that's currently the case. Maybe those of you on the call kind of understand this frustration sometimes with the language we use around identity as well. But this kind of final stage, it's really just adding to the layers of the challenges. We have multiple policies with a single resource or identity. How do we know which policy takes effect? And then, when I think about this too, I'm always thinking about another aspect of this is as you scale up, you have more of these policies to manage and maybe more assets, and maybe we're dealing with a multi-cloud scenario. So working out of a single vendor console, maybe you're not even getting a true picture of your cloud security access. So I'm kind of curious your thoughts on, cloud native tooling and managing this complexity in a vendor console versus outside of that, and that whole idea. Yeah,
absolutely. And not all is lost. Let me put it this way: not all is lost. There are some native tools that cloud providers provide. Let's take AWS, for example, right? There are 3 different tools that AWS provides. Like, let's take Policy Simulator, right? Policy Simulator is an excellent tool where you can input some types of policies, and then comes on the other side of the tool comes out the output, which says who can access what. That's fantastic, right? But the problem there is it's single-threaded in the sense, not literally single-threaded, in the sense that you can only enter one user at a time or one resource at a time, right? Let's say if you want to ask the question, given an S3 bucket, I want to see all the users who can access that S3 bucket. You cannot get that answer through Policy Simulator, right? So that's one of the drawbacks. The other drawbacks is when you are running into API rate limits as a customer, you can only query certain number of APIs to AWS. Basically, you can connect to those AWS APIs at certain rates. Now you're hitting that upper ceiling of rate limits because you have to worry about other services, right? You don't want to consume all the APIs just by running this Policy Simulator, right? That's another challenge. And then there are other tools like Access Analyzer, that is the Access Advisor. All these are fantastic tools, but they have their own limitations, right? So think of this as a complementary approach. You continue to use your AWS provided native tools, but that's not going to solve your entire challenge. The other part is where you need to bring in a different tool to combine these together to have a real answer of who can access what, and at scale and fully automated.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I think these tools are maybe useful to answer tangential questions or kind of like one-off use cases, but they don't really have that full like macro view and also the granular understanding that you might need. And obviously, that's a great segue kind of into our final third portion of the presentation here, kind of talking about building and automating effective solutions at scale. So we've talked about that background. We've talked about how cloud identity might be different than traditional identity, or just kind of where these extra complexities come from. We talked about those different challenges that Sudarshan walked us through. And now we can kind of focus on, okay, how should we build effective access? And one thing for me that I always try and think about is, when I'm an identity manager or I'm a security engineer, how does my day-to-day get better with this tooling? How does the right solution kind of arm me to make my day a little better? So I guess kind of thinking about that before we get into it all, Sudarshan, any thoughts as you're building this tooling about that question of making someone's day-to-day get better and simpler?
That's a fantastic question, because a lot of times we just start building the product, but you don't really understand the how do I operationalize that product, right? That's the key question that you're trying to ask. The operation side, how do we make life of a security analyst or IAM admin easier, right? That's the right question to ask here, right? If you think about it this way, as a SOC analyst or a security operator, any from a security team guy, if I want to answer that question of who can access what today, think about in AWS term. I have to go to AWS console, I have to open up 10 different policies for that user. I have to manually parse and see whether, let's take EC2, for example. EC2, I want to look at the policy statement. I have to compare that across multiple policies and then figure out who can access what, right? Think about the amount of time you're dedicating as a manual work. That is all gone with this capability, right? That's the first one. The second one is, let's say if the policy is updated, let's say your SCP is updated, your permission boundary is updated, basically the guardrails is updated. Now, how do I know how does that impact my user? How does that impact a specific machine identity, right? So that real-time data, you need that real-time understanding of how does that change my access level. That is also not possible today. That's what we are trying to automate for our customers and provide that in the fingertip. And then the other part is, if I want to simulate, let's say I don't want to put it into production. I want to try out with the changes that I'm making in a specific policy. I want to try out how does that change my access for a specific group of users, a specific role, or a specific machine identity. Before you deploy it into production, you can simulate and validate if that policy is supposed to do what it's supposed to do, right? Going back to the first question that you talked about, what are the challenges? This is exactly what we are trying to solve, that specific challenge of, even if I build a policy, how do you know how effective that policy is? How do you know it's actually achieving that objective, right? And then also we provide the flexibility to mix and match different types of policies. So let's say I don't want to apply SCPs, or I don't want to apply permission boundary. Tell me, how does that access look like? So we provide that flexibility and make sure that you have all the answers in a single place so that you can go about making your life much easier. That's what we are trying to do here.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I think kind of walking through this list on the slide here, it's really easy to see the tangible solutions to alleviate the pain points that we just talked about. You know, it's easy to kind of talk about this, but I really enjoy kind of showing it as well. So why don't we talk about a couple examples of, say, given an identity, what can that identity access, or what can those actions it can perform? So, you know, really showing, not just telling about, okay, who can access what in our system, and really breaking that down. So I'll hand this slide over to you.
Absolutely. So what you see here is basically you can pick any identity, right? It could be a machine or a user identity. You click on that, you say, give me the effective access permissions, right? So what we do is we go and get the updated policies, no matter what the latest version is. And then we look at a course level access. When I say course level, at the per service, like let's take S3 or let's take KMS, what you can see here is a KMS and S3. I can tell whether that user or a role has a write permission, list, or tag permissions. So the full green circle that you see is basically mean full access. Hollow circle means no access at all, or at the service level. That's a service level, that's a course level access control. Now, if I want to ask the question, okay, that's great, you have given me S3 level, but I want to drill deeper and understand what specific commands can I access, or can this user access, or what specific commands is he or she denied. That granular level is also possible. So what you see here is I'm clicking on KMS. Within KMS, you can tell who can list the keys. Right now, you can see list keys is allowed, whereas get public key, whereas decrypt and encrypt is denied. So at the specific API level, we can tell who can access what. Going back to the 40,000 APIs that we talked about in the beginning of the call, so we get to the granular level. Every API call, starting with AWS, we have 12,000 API calls. We can tell you those 12,000 API calls within your, let's say you have 10,000 identities. We can absolutely tell you all those 10,000 identities, how many of them can access those 12,000 API calls, right? That's the essence of this here.
That's awesome. And I think the core part of that is that, you know, it should all be seamless. You know, we shouldn't be adding to the complexity. We should actually be reducing complexity. And I think that's what you've been able to achieve here, is like, it makes it really manageable at a high level. You know, I want to know what my different services are and kind of their permissions. But if I want to get granular and look at kind of the fine grain level permission results, or what actual identities are able to access what, I think that becomes very seamless as well. So on the flip side, we just talked about, you know, an identity and what it's able to access. We're also dealing with resources in the cloud. So given, say, an S3 bucket, I need to know which users have effective access. Maybe walk us through this scenario as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So to your point, take S3 as an example, right? S3 has a lot of buckets, right? And let's say it's a production bucket that you are putting all the data in, or you have a CloudTrail bucket. Let's take CloudTrail data is pushed to S3, right? So you put all the CloudTrail data in S3, or you have some critical data, business critical data, or PIA data that is residing in an S3 bucket. Now I want to know who can access that bucket. Even if I know who can access, I want to know what level of access do they have. Do they have read? Do they have write? Whatever that question, right? The next level is, even if I know they have write, I want to know what specific write command can that user execute, right? That is the level of depth that you need to be aware of. So in this case, if you look at the UI that's coming up here, so I'm picking an S3, and then I'm picking a specific bucket, and then say, give me the effective access. So now it will tell you who are the users. There are 3 users here who can access that S3 bucket, and what level of access do they have? Do they have list, read, or write? And then I pick a specific user, and then say that user can do list bucket. That user cannot do delete bucket. So that is the level of granularity that you need to answer that question, both for security use case as well as compliance use cases.
No, that's really helpful, and I really enjoy that that shift between going high level and being able to get really granular. And I think you did a great job walking that through, both the identity piece and the resource piece. So I do want to be mindful of everyone's time here, so I want to open it up to the Q&A. I've seen a couple of questions come in throughout the webinar, so I'm happy to kind of take those and hand them off to you, Sudarshan, as well. But if you have any other thoughts, definitely let us know. So the first one, let me see. You mentioned automation as a part of solving these problems. Where does automation actually fit in the solution set, and how do you leverage or rely on automation?
Yeah, so when you say automation, think about, we talked about one user, one like simulator, right? You can do only one at a time, right? And even that, you cannot give the resource level viewers. Given a resource, I want to give all the permissions. So if you want to do that, we provide APIs so that you can automate yourselves and then run it at scale. If you have 10,000 roles, and then I want to find out and update all the roles and find out what the access permissions are, we provide that, we completely automate that for you and store the results for you. All you have to do is query through the UI. You don't even have to build a query. You can just go through the UI and find out who can access what. That's what I mean by automation.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, that's extremely useful too, because as you scale up, you want to get away from manual processes, and you want to include that in a safe but scalable manner. Thanks for answering that one. So the other one was, should we treat human versus machine/resource identities differently?
No. So all of them are the same. It's just that everybody has a policy, right? In AWS term, humans have policies, machine identities have policies. Machine identities have an identity, right? They can assume a role. Humans can assume the role. There are a lot of commonalities when it comes to human and machine identities. The only difference is machine identities are, like, in terms of ratio, 1:10. For every human identity, there are 10 machine identities. That's where the difference is. Machine identities are so huge. The sprawl is phenomenal, especially in the cloud service as well. That is where, going back to the first question, we want to automate that at scale for these machine identities and provide that access, the fine-grained granular access, effective access for organizations to consume.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everyone who joined us. I do want to be mindful of the time. So, Sudarshan, any closing thoughts or kind of lasting impressions before we let everyone go?
Nothing, though. Think about, how do you scale with all the native tools that you have? Think about how you can answer that question, who can access what. That's going to be absolutely critical for you, no matter that's a compliance, your day-to-day handling your insider threats or external threats. That's a key part of identity, and that's why it's called the security perimeter for the cloud-native world.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Sudarshan. I really enjoyed being able to chat with you and kind of answer and walk through all of these discussion topics. Everyone who joined us today, have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week. And feel free to follow up with any questions. Sudarshan and I love talking about this stuff on these webinars, but also just offline as well. So my email is here. And yeah, really enjoyed everything, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.